Yeah.
Should I be?
No. I'm the only one who has to fear these. So very kind to the guests. So all right. So reducing inflammation, and I know there's something with gut health. Tell me one more time.
Using gut health to fight inflammation and autoimmunity.
Beautiful. Okay. Good morning. I see a lot of familiar faces out there today. Welcome, everybody. Cynthia's got her hair up today, not the usual glamour do. She's in model weekend look. The Peffleys. All right, good to see you guys. All right, so everybody, so here's the deal. So we have something super exciting today, which I'm sure you guys all know, which is why you're here. I'm going to ask if you don't mind putting your camera on. We like to see faces, although if you're in some kind of witness protection program or being sought after by a motorcycle gang or something like that, I don't want to be responsible for you getting caught. So Beth, we can actually turn off the non-video participants. And my guest, again, back by popular demand, repeat performance, not repeat performance, but this is going to be new ground. The role of gut health in reducing inflammation and autoimmunity with my very special guest and new friend and new nutritionist, who I congratulated today on me hitting my highest weight ever, Jill Brook. I didn't start following any of her instructions yet, so I can't put that on her. I'm looking forward to it. Jill Brook, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here again.
Oh, thanks for having me again. Like I always say, your community is really special, so I'm honored to be here. And today, as you might recall, today was the stuff I was actually more excited to talk about, because last week we talked about some things you can do to just kind of get by and manage some conditions. And the stuff we're talking about today, there's some evidence and some theories that we can maybe do better than just manage, that we can actually halt and reverse some inflammation and the damage that it causes. So that's one exciting thing. The other exciting thing is, last week I was with you because I'm not a pulmonary specialist. I'm a dysautonomia specialist, but we were talking about how some forms of dysautonomia can have many different underlying causes. And I always am happy when I get a client who has autoimmunity as one of their potential underlying causes, because that's where I have more things to offer. And a paper just came out 2 days ago from London suggesting that the dysautonomia that occurs after COVID, they do suspect is autoimmune. So that is, that's good news. As far as if you're gonna have it, at least having that type of it, nutrition does have some things that suggest may be able to halt it. I know it's hard to find a silver lining to that.
Awesome. So without further ado, if that's how you say that word, let's get it on. Let's get ready to rumble.
So I'm going to share part of my screen, if that's okay.
Of course.
Oh, I think you need to let me share my screen.
Good to go.
There we go. All right. Okay, are you seeing that?
So we're seeing it. It's not quite in the middle. For me. No, I think it is. You're good.
That's good enough?
Yep.
All right. So as Noah said,
I'm going to share some reigning theories today about how we can improve gut health to fight chronic inflammation and or autoimmunity. But first, as before, this is meant as education, not advice. Talk to your doctor before making significant dietary changes. I'm sharing theories today. Nothing in nutrition really has randomized placebo-controlled trials behind it because nutrition just almost never gets that level of evidence. So just keep that in mind. And finally, this picture is me doing acro yoga, which I kind of have to do because I have trouble staying upright too long because I have autoimmune dysautonomia. So thank you for understanding if I recline or put my feet up while we talk. Let's just start with a review that inflammation is the body's response to a threat or an irritant. The heat, redness, and swelling are your body bringing blood to an area, attacking any pathogens, and clearing out damaged tissue. And this is great and necessary if you have a broken ankle, for example, or a virus. But the inflammation should ideally stop once the problem is solved. And we know that an inflammatory response does do a little bit of collateral damage to surrounding tissues, but that's not a big deal if the inflammation is brief. If it's acute inflammation, it gets in, it does its job, and then it stops, and that's great. Chronic inflammation, on the other hand, never shuts off. So the collateral damage to surrounding tissue can add up over time. And one particular type of chronic inflammation is autoimmunity. And that happens when the immune system specifically targets some of your healthy tissue. Now, why would it do that? One reigning theory is called molecular mimicry. And it says it's because sometimes you get unlucky and you have some bodily tissues that look a lot like a pathogen to your immune system. So the immune system can't tell them apart and attacks both of them at the same time, both the legitimate threat and your innocent tissue that resembles it. So there are over 100 different autoimmune conditions identified so far, and they're identifying more all the time. Each one depends on the different type of healthy tissue that's getting attacked by the immune system. But you don't have to have a full-blown autoimmune disease to have excessive inflammation causing harm. This Washington Post article summarizes it really nicely. The headline is, "Chronic inflammation is long-lasting, insidious, dangerous, and you may not even know you have it." It discusses how scientists from 22 institutions recently wrote a paper warning that, quote, "Chronic inflammation is involved in not just a few select disorders, but a wide variety of very serious physical and mental health conditions. And indeed, chronic inflammatory diseases are the most significant cause of death in the world today, with more than 50% of all deaths being attributable to inflammation-related diseases." So, given that, I think everybody should be interested in the emerging evidence about how gut health may be a huge underlying factor in chronic inflammation. And better yet, how we can do a lot to change our gut health for the better to fight chronic inflammation, right? So as I was saying last time, as somebody with an autoimmune condition myself, this is the part I wish I had known 20 or 30 years earlier, because I think I could have prevented so much damage that my immune system did to my autonomic nerves, for example. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about what is the gut, what does it do? We're going to talk about two aspects of gut health. The first is called intestinal permeability. The second one has to do with the microbes that live in the gut. And then we'll talk about how does gut health affect inflammation and autoimmunity? And most importantly, what can we do to improve gut health? So gut health means the functioning of our intestines and the trillions of microbes that live there. It's so easy to think nothing of this body part, and I know I never thought much about it until, several years ago, but there's really some amazing and important stuff that goes on there. So let's get to know our amazing intestines.
Jill, before
They're,
we do that, could I just make one comment?
oh, sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to let you know that this is being recorded. There's going to be a lot of information here. So don't feel like you have to furiously, copy everything down or write everything down. It will be available to you. And we're also going to ask, just from an intellectual property perspective, that you please don't screenshot. Again, we will make this available to you on our website. But this is Jill's work, and we want to share. And but don't feel like you have to catch everything. This is the kind of thing where you can watch it over and over again and learn something new every time you watch it. Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know some people are more into the details and some people just want sort of the big picture, and whatever you get out of this, there's a summary slide at the end where it kind of tells you all the takeaways. And so this, hopefully you can just kind of find it interesting and maybe motivating later on when you're thinking about what to eat. But so our intestines are about 25 feet long, and they're a tube going from stomach to the anus. They're a tube that gets filled up with all the food you eat so that nutrients and energy can be absorbed into the bloodstream. And that's really important because technically the food in your intestines is not really inside your body yet. It's in that tube that's going through you from mouth to anus. And so it's technically still the outside world. Now, if it passes through the intestinal wall, then it will be inside you. So I'd like to take a minute to think about that 1 ton of food passing through that tube every year. That's a lot of material to sort through, right? Your intestines need to process all of that, sort the trash from the treasure, and absorb the good stuff while ejecting the unneeded or harmful stuff. And that's a lot of really important work, which might be why the gut is home to some really important things, such as around 2/3 or more of your immune system, more neurotransmitter production than in the brain, about 100 million neurons, which is more than are found in the spinal cord or the peripheral nervous system. And the large intestine, or the colon, is home to trillions of microbes, making up the largest part of the human microbiome. The hypothesis is that the gut needs to be incredibly sophisticated because it is the largest border that our bodies have with the outside world. The intestines, when stretched out, have a surface area of around 1 to 2 tennis courts, depending on the estimate. So that's a lot of border to patrol, right? That means that the intestinal barrier has a supremely important job to do. It needs to decide what gets to enter into our bodies and what stays out. And the goal, of course, is to let in the healthy nutrients while keeping out the harmful viruses, bacteria, toxins, undigested food particles, etc. And the intestinal barrier is only 1 cell thick, and our bloodstream is on the other side of it. So whatever crosses the barrier is now circulating in our body, free to move anywhere in the body. And that's a really big deal, right? So there are some little gates in the intestinal wall that can be signaled to open or to close, to either let things in or to keep them out. And these little gates are called tight junctions. That word will come up again. And there's growing research about how our lifestyle and diet can make tight junctions be more open or more closed. What can happen in an unhealthy gut is that the tight junctions can be too wide open too often, allowing unwanted things into the bloodstream. And it's sometimes called leaky gut. You've probably heard that term. So in this picture, you can see healthy tight junctions on the left, where nothing much is getting through until the intestines decide to let something through. And on the right, there are a few leaky tight junctions, which might be allowing microorganisms through, or undigested food particles, toxins, potential pathogens. And like we said, the bloodstream is right on the other side of that barrier. So once that type of junk is in the bloodstream, what do you expect the immune system is going to do? Give that a thought for a second. The immune system may just start doing its job, right? i.e., attacking anything it deems potentially dangerous, right? And that creates inflammation. So if this happens all the time because junk is constantly leaking in through the leaky gut, then inflammation is chronic and it can cause collateral damage to healthy tissues. Now, in susceptible people, this could theoretically lead to autoimmunity, right? We talked about the theory of molecular mimicry, which says that if our immune system is attacking something, say a virus, and we just happen to have some bodily tissues that resemble that virus at a molecular level, then the immune system may attack both because it cannot tell the difference. So letting more junk into the bloodstream all the time means more opportunities for that to happen. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So, So here are some things known to increase intestinal permeability, right? Infections is on there. In a minute, you'll see there's already a study out showing that COVID infection may play a role in that. You'll see wheat gluten on there. It is believed that the reason so many people feel inflammatory reactions to wheat gluten, even if they don't have a wheat allergy or celiac disease, it's that gluten signals those tight junctions to open up more. It makes the little gates in the intestinal barrier open up. So this allows more stuff to get in the bloodstream, right? And so the immune system might be reacting to any part of that junk. So going off gluten is one way to get tight junctions. And we think that's the reason so many people feel better when they go off gluten. The other things on there probably don't surprise you. Dysbiosis we'll talk about because that's a big one. Now, let me just say the exciting part of the leaky gut theory is that it suggests that if we stop letting in pathogens into our bloodstream, then the immune system won't have so much to get riled up about. If it's not riled up all the time, there will be less inflammation. So intestinal permeability is one very important aspect of gut health. And the other one, which goes hand in hand, is the community of microbes that live in the intestines, right? And these two things are highly related, as you'll see, because the microbes do a lot of different jobs, but one of them is maintaining the health of that intestinal wall. So the gut microbiome is the trillions of microbes that live in the colon in the last few feet of the intestines. And we only became aware of their enormous power relatively recently. And so this is the reason that I thought I was eating healthy for years, but really wasn't, because microbes change everything. So the gut microbiome consists of over 1,500 different kinds of bacteria, yeast, viruses, fungi, other little critters, and most of them are friendly. Ideally, they would all be doing different beneficial things for us, but we can also get bad microbes that do harmful things. And we have, when we have too many of the bad microbes, it's called dysbiosis. You'll see that word a lot. And the good and the bad microbes compete for space and resources. So having more good ones can help keep the bad ones from thriving. And it's important to remember that more diversity of microbes is associated with better health, probably because every different type of microbe has a different important job to do. So if we're missing important microbe diversity, then we're missing out on the skill set of that species. So this is just a list of some things that they typically do in the body, such as helping to digest food, extract nutrients, produce substances that the body can use for fuel or for healing, helping to regulate the immune system and preventing pathogens from moving in. You'll see that I circled one important thing that they do. They produce short chain fatty acids, and those are the building blocks of a healthy intestinal wall. So our gut microbes are in charge of maintaining that gut wall, right? But spoiler alert, they can only create short chain fatty acids when we eat plant fiber. So we'll come back to that later. They can only do their job right if we feed them right. So microbes are so influential that researchers can look at the gut microbes in a baby's first poop and predict their likelihood of getting asthma. Microbes are so powerful that researchers can make identical twin rats, either skinny or obese, just by implanting different microbes. Microbes are so powerful that researchers can manipulate behavior in rats by changing their microbes. They can make the rats either more or less fearful and anxious or more or less social. Microbes are so powerful that researchers can make a rodent either have no reaction to a pulmonary virus or have an extreme inflammatory reaction to a pulmonary virus just by putting different microbes into their intestines. And here's the craziest thing to me. Microbes are so powerful that they explain why babies born by C-section historically had higher risk for allergies, asthma, depression, obesity, and autoimmune conditions. It's because we get the start of our microbiomes when we're born. So while we're traveling out the birth canal during birth, the mother's gut microbes get into the baby's mouth, and those microbes get swallowed and become the anchor tenants of the baby's gut microbiome, which continues to evolve from there. So can you guess what happens differently in a C-section birth? If you think about it, what are the first microbes they are exposed to, right? So when babies are born by C-section, they don't go through the birth canal or get the mother's gut microbes in their mouths. Their first exposure to gut microbes is from the hands of the doctor, which are totally different microbes and with much less diversity. And this was discovered to be a huge disadvantage. So like I said, these babies grew up to have more allergies, asthma, depression, obesity, and autoimmune disorders, all conditions related to inflammation, and all because of starting life with a less diverse microbiome. So luckily they figured that out. And now in many hospitals, if a baby needs to be born by C-section, they'll use a sponge to take some fluids from the mom's birth canal and put it in the baby's mouth and nose to try to get them the initial microbiome that nature intended. So hopefully I've convinced you that microbes are super influential. I think we're just at the beginning of learning how influential. When it comes to inflammation, we know that good microbes maintain and repair a healthy intestinal barrier. So that means the immune system has less to react to. And they also release anti-inflammatory metabolites right into the bloodstream, which signal the immune system to be more calm and relaxed when there's no major emergencies going on, and to be more appropriately aggressive when there are dangers that it needs to take care of. On the other hand, bad gut microbes or dysbiosis has the opposite effect. Those microbes can create toxins which leak into the bloodstream and trigger the immune system to be more inflammatory. They can also signal the immune system to respond inappropriately to all sorts of pathogens, right? And you may be thinking, so how exactly would the gut send signals to other parts of the body? And this paper describes 3 different ways that the gut can do that. And the details aren't really important right now for our purposes, so I'm not going to take time right now, but it just means that the gut has incredible influence beyond its local area, right? So that explains why
gut health appears to affect all health. Gut health has been implicated in the development of numerous diseases in every organ. It's implicated in the development of heart problems, COPD, depression, schizophrenia, renal failure, autism, chronic fatigue syndrome, intestinal disorders, skin disorders, and there's more here. And more findings are coming out every week, connecting gut health to something new that seems like it should be completely non-related, right? This is just a smattering of headlines that I found interesting because they link gut health to mental disorders, recovery after a spinal cord injury, Alzheimer's disease, obesity, diabetes, Parkinson's, neurological disorders in general, autoimmune disease in general. And I was interested to see, maybe you guys already knew about this, but there's several mentions of the gut-lung axis as a new topic of research, like at the Mayo Clinic and elsewhere. And I knew that there was a gut-brain axis they're describing how much the brain and the gut communicate and affect one another, but the gut-lung axis was new to me, so I kind of looked into it. And according to the Mayo Clinic, the gut-lung axis concept posits that alterations of intestinal microbes may have a profound effect on lung disease. Microbes may be recognized by host immune cells, host, that means us, the humans, host immune cells, resulting in systemic cytokine release, that's inflammation, or in some cases, the bugs make drugs such that bioactive compounds are secreted by microbes, absorbed into circulation, and directly alter lung function. According to the Mayo Clinic, pulmonary researchers are naturally interested in the microbes that live in the lung. However, the intestinal microbes may be even more important than the lung microbes in some pulmonary diseases. So one more example of how gut health is just everywhere is in the considerable interest in the connection between gut health and COVID. I went onto pubmed.gov and found a few papers already written and 23 clinical trials already registered to look at gut health in COVID patients. One of these papers already found that COVID changes gut health for the worse, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But all of this is just to emphasize that gut health is more important than it may appear at first. And it seems that no matter where in your body you may have inflammation, the gut may be relevant. These little bugs have reached far beyond their home in the colon. But speaking of their home in the colon, sometimes they sneak out of the colon, and location matters.
Jill, can I ask a question?
Yep.
Where does pH and acidity come into all of this? If that's way off track, we could get to it later. But so much of what we've seen, A, with respiratory diseases, and B, with COVID long haulers, has to do with increased acid reflux, and that seems to trigger inflammation, not just in the lungs, but also in the sinuses and other areas as well.
So there's a few interesting things that come to mind for that. One of them actually has to do with this Sibo right here. Sibo happens when the gut microbes that are supposed to stay in your colon in the last few feet of your intestines, when they sneak up north into your small intestines, then they can create a lot of problems. And one of the big ones they can create is more acidity in the body. They can also change your gut motility. And we know that some people get that reflux because their intestines are not moving the way that they're supposed to, So instead of having food move through nicely, it just kind of stops and sits there. And it isn't flowing the right direction, so it can come back up. I think that as far as, so when that acid does come up into the esophagus and into the mouth, that definitely can do some tissue damage. because you're not meant to have acid right there.
And in the lung,
And
in the airways as well.
yeah. And in my world, what we try to do is focus on getting rid of the Sibo, the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and helping the gut motility, because once your digestive system is moving everything through the right direction nicely again, you tend to have less of it, less reflux.
So, similarly to the heart and the lungs, like if you have, let's say, backflow from the left ventricle to the left atrium, like we know that everything kind of goes back like plumbing. So does the GI system behave in the same way, that anything kind of further down can work its way back up?
Well, in theory, that's not supposed to happen. You're supposed to have these nice waves of peristalsis that are always moving things south. We're not supposed to really have things moving north, but we know that dysautonomia can cause nerve damage, and it maybe some other issues as well that make those waves not happen the way they're supposed to. And um, and so, yeah, those people do encounter a lot of problems like nausea or vomiting or Sibo, where, yeah, things are moving the wrong direction.
Got it.
Um, we know that one thing that can help is taking longer breaks from eating. And I know this goes a little contrary. Like, I know at least in the dysautonomia literature, everybody always says you got to just eat little meals all the time, just be constantly snacking, and so that you don't overwhelm your digestive tract. And I think that has some good thinking behind it. But from the gut health perspective, you actually do want to take breaks from eating, because that's the only time that you get the intestinal cleaning wave. It's called the migrating motor complex. And it's this nice cleaning wave that does a bunch of housekeeping, and it just pushes everything through, including any bacteria that might be climbing up the wrong direction, um, other little things that might be moving the wrong direction. But in order to get that, you need to go a good 4 or 5 hours without eating. And
Wow.
so, so some people find, I know it's kind of hard when you can't eat very much at one time. How are you supposed to take 5 hours between, bites of cracker? So it's kind of a delicate balance, but it's something you can try and see if that helps keep things moving the right direction more.
It's so interesting, like everything that you talk about, it's like, every like 30 seconds you say something that like I've never heard before, or like you discuss nutrition in a way that nobody else discusses. And it's like, I'm so happy that you're here, because I really think that so much of this is really linked to what we're talking about, and some of the problems that, not just long haulers, but anybody with inflammation is really facing.
Yeah, and I think so many of our instincts are wrong. I mean, I always feel like I need to apologize for the history of nutrition giving terrible advice for decades. Um, and it's so much like, especially before we knew about the gut microbes, right? So think about how, okay, as soon as you lose weight and you can't put weight on and you can't really eat, what do? Oh, well, you start living on milkshakes, because that's the way to get in the most calories, or you live on pizza and burgers. I mean, I remember, I got sick. It was a couple decades ago now, but I remember getting down to 80 pounds, not being able to really digest anything, and thinking, well, darn it, if I'm gonna not gain weight or absorb any of this anyways, at least I'm going to get to live on croissants, right? This is the one thing that makes me happy. And now looking back, like, okay, what is that? That's wheat gluten bombs, right? Not the best thing to get your gut health back. And just so many of our instincts, I think, have been wrong because we didn't know about gut microbes. And a lot of what a lot of these things take a long time to change. And so I think that still we all kind of have some of these old pre-gut microbiome ideas in our heads. and it makes it really easy to do things that we think are helping that maybe aren't.
But we're all going to start over tomorrow. And then,
That's right.
so I'm glad you're here. This is perfect timing.
Oh, good. So I just would like to mention quick about Sibo because so many people in this space have it. There's so many times that I'm talking to a client and they'll be describing their symptoms to me, and I'll be thinking, oh boy, I think you might have Sibo. And the truth is that until you treat Sibo, if you have it, most other nutritional things are not really going to help you. So, as I said, Sibo, it stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And it happens when the microbes in your colon climb out, go north, and they take up residence in your small intestine where they're not supposed to be. And it can cause a lot of bloating, gas, stomach aches, brain fog, diarrhea or constipation or alternating, and they can speed up or slow down your digestion. The top Sibo researcher at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, Dr. Mark Pimentel, he estimates that 70% of IBS is actually caused by Sibo. And that's important to know because I think most people think IBS is not treatable. You just have to live with it. And Sibo is treatable. And at least in my world of autoimmunity and dysautonomia and mast cell activation, like so few things are actually treatable with just 10 days of a pill. So when you get something like that, you take advantage of it. And so the important thing about Sibo is to find a doctor who's really familiar with it and who can treat it. A lot of doctors are not familiar with it because some of this is new information. But when you get rid of Sibo, you can get rid of a lot of symptoms. We can come back to this later if Sibo is of interest. I kind of want to move on to the bigger picture, but if Sibo is your problem, I almost think that's lucky because that one, you can just treat it and be done with it, and it improves a lot of things. Okay, so moving on with the big picture. Your microbiome is kind of like a huge army that can either work for you or against you in a lot of different ways and with enormous influence. If we can harness this thing to work for us, that's great. If it turns against us, look out. Looping back to that autoimmune or inflammatory theory, there's evidence suggesting that 3 things are necessary to perpetuate chronic inflammation or autoimmunity. And you'll see here in this triangle, it's genetics, environmental factors, and gut dysbiosis. So the good news is that researchers think that poor gut health is not only necessary for autoimmune or inflammatory conditions, but it's reversible. And the way that it would be reversible is by getting rid of the dysbiosis and reestablishing that intestinal barrier function, right? So I found this interesting. It seems like COVID triggered a lot of people to have new inflammatory conditions. So I just found this article interesting. It suggests that having COVID can cause dysbiosis. In this study, they took regular poop samples from hospitalized COVID patients and looked at the microbes in them to see if they changed over time. And I'll just read from it. It says, quote, fecal microbiomes from patients with COVID-19 had depletion of symbionts, that's friendly microbes, and enrichment of opportunistic pathogens, that's bad microbes, which persisted after clearance of SARS-CoV-2. Impact, these findings indicate the prolonged effect of SARS-CoV-2 infection on the microbiomes of patients with COVID-19. So that's interesting, right? Does it explain part of what's happening to some people? I know some of you got inflammatory conditions that started with COVID, and I don't know if that explains it, but either way, here is some really good news. We have a lot of control over our microbial communities because they have to eat whatever we give them. We can feed the good microbes and starve the bad ones. When I say they eat what we eat, technically they eat whatever reaches the colon after we've absorbed a lot of our food. So that means they eat a lot of fiber. This figure, it says it's a schematic representation of how diet shapes the human gut microbiota and impacts on chronic disease risk, unquote. So you'll notice that the food pyramid that's good for microbes is more Mediterranean and less of a Western diet. The Western diet is the one for dysbiosis and chronic disease. So the friendly bacteria, they call it microbiota symbiosis, that's friendly bacteria. They thrive on fiber from whole plant foods, especially fruits and vegetables, but also whole grains, legumes, herbs, nuts, and seeds. And they do not do well with processed foods, especially processed foods containing antimicrobial ingredients, right? That makes sense? That antimicrobial ingredients are, by design, harmful to microbes, right? But there are tons of antimicrobials in processed foods, such as preservatives, high amounts of sodium, antibiotics show up in a lot of foods, herbicides and pesticides. Artificial sweeteners are also found to really disturb gut microbes a lot. So the friendly gut flora in us, just like a whole lot of clean plant fiber, which is why these food pyramids for friendly and unfriendly microbes have all the plant foods not only promoting friendly bacteria, but also actively hurting the unfriendly bacteria, right? So in theory, every time you eat broccoli, you're not only helping some friendly bacteria, you're killing some bad bacteria, because the good and the bad microbes compete for space and resources. So by supporting the good ones, we can help squeeze out the bad ones. In addition to that, we can actively starve the unfriendly bacteria by taking away their preferred fuel, which is sugar, processed or refined carbohydrates, fatty, cheap meat, and basically any unnatural ingredients. So this is just some details. We talked about how the good microbes mostly live on fiber from whole plant foods. The US RDA for fiber is only 25 grams a day for women and 38 for men. And most Americans only get about half that. But our Paleolithic ancestors are estimated to have eaten more like 100 grams of fiber every day, or even 150 grams of fiber every day. So that may be closer to what our microbes evolved for. Now, obviously, don't go and tomorrow up your fiber intake by 90 grams. If you were going to up your fiber intake, you'd want to do it gradually and let your microbes have time to adjust and make sure your digestive tract can handle that, because that would be a pretty big shock to the system. But it's not just the quantity of fiber that matters, but the variety, right? So the way to get a diversity of good microbes is to give them a diversity of different whole plant foods, ideally colorful ones from every food group and every part of the plant. So that means eating plant foods some that are seeds or roots or stalks or leaves or fruits or flowers, like every part of the plant, because it all has good things to offer. Fermented vegetables like sauerkraut and kimchi are also fantastic, because they not only have fiber to feed the good microbes, but they actually contain their own actual microbes, those probiotics, which can do good things as they travel through the gut. And like we said, the foods to minimize are the sugar, refined carbs, excessive salt, artificial sweeteners, chemicals, toxins, and factory farmed animal foods that can be full of antibiotics and chemicals. So those are good to avoid too.
Jill, can I ask what the effect of cooking these things are? Like, for example, if you heat and cook sauerkraut, does that in any way detrimentally affect the value of it?
Yeah, in theory, you probably would kill a lot of the microbes in sauerkraut. So you probably get a lot more out of that if you eat it raw. When it comes um, to just other plant foods, though, it's wonderful either way. The fiber will do good things and reach those microbes, whether it's cooked or raw.
Does putting it on a hot dog in any way decrease its value?
Well, I've heard that some people are now roasting carrots and eating them like hot dogs. I don't know if that's a
Okay.
huge buzzkill.
So carrot instead of hot dog. Note to self. Thank you.
There are some people who have made quite an art out of making vegetables taste and feel like more exciting things, like turning the cauliflower into risotto with the riced cauliflower, or the zucchini noodles, making the zoodles. I'm a big fan. I feel like that's sort of the modern day alchemy, if you can turn your vegetables into more exciting things. But yeah, unfortunately, hot dogs are an example of something we're about to talk about. Unless you're getting the super high quality swanky hot dogs, factory farmed foods are kind of a big problem. And I think sometimes people are surprised to hear that animal protein isn't always helpful. And it really depends on how the animal was raised, because those pesticides and the hormones, and especially the antibiotics, those all bioaccumulate up the food chain. So when we eat chicken or pork or whatever full of antibiotics, that, by design affects the microbes in our gut. We actually, they've done studies. You can watch the inflammation spike within hours of eating factory farmed foods. And I know that the higher quality cuts of meat, the free range or the grass fed or the pastured or the wild cut, that all gets a lot healthier, but more expensive. But the good news is you probably don't need to replace it one for one, since most Westerners are way overeating animal protein anyways. And that's a little hard on our kidneys. It ages us. And so just cutting down on animal protein, and eating more plant foods is a way to have your cake and have it be cheap too. I don't know if that really makes sense, but get the best of both worlds. So a few other ingredients that are known to be really bad for inflammation and autoimmunity are industrial additives, right? So this article explains how seven different aspects of processed food cause leaky gut, how every one of these processing methods is growing in popularity year after year. There's probably many other industrial additives that are bad too. These are just the ones they happen to have studied. But they think that this is actually largely responsible for some of our higher rates of autoimmune disorders and inflammation year after year. And so that kind of goes in hand. It's not only the industrial additives in food. Chemicals from other sources matter too. So this article is in the journal Nature. It's about chronic inflammation as a cause of disease across the lifespan. And it says each year, an estimated 2,000 new chemicals are introduced into items that individuals use or ingest daily, including foods, personal care products, prescription drugs, household cleaners, and lawn care products. And research has demonstrated that numerous chemicals to which people are commonly exposed greatly alter molecular signaling pathways that underlie inflammation and inflammation-related disease risk, right? So that's why it can be really helpful to change your soaps, shampoos, cleaning products, etc., to things that use more natural ingredients. I know that I didn't know this until I got into this world, but I don't think most people realize that all of these new chemicals, these 2,000 new chemicals that get introduced into our products every year, they're not really usually required to have any safety testing performed before they're allowed in products. New chemicals are basically considered innocent until proven guilty. And I know that with 2,000 new chemicals entering our personal products every year, I imagine it's not that easy to determine which ones are causing our invisible inflammation. So if you're trying to fight inflammation, you might just err on the side of avoiding unnatural chemicals. But getting back to food. Okay, so starving the bad microbes means cutting back on processed foods or foods with really dense carbohydrates like sugar. And doing this might be hard because when you starve the bad microbes, they may put up a fight. Now, I think that this is absolutely hilarious and intriguing. And Noah, tomorrow when you start eating clean, see if you notice this. So this is an article called "Is Eating Behavior Manipulated by the Gastrointestinal Microbiota?" And the authors write, quote, "Like microscopic puppet masters, microbes may control the eating behavior of hosts," that's us, "through a number of potential mechanisms," unquote. So these authors believe microbes evolved to have the power to control our eating habits because the ones who could do that thrived more. So they believe that they can produce neurotransmitters. They can make toxins to make us feel cranky until we eat the food that they want us to. They think that the microbes can change our taste buds and or alter our reward systems. So I think that's just amazing.
Last cup of coffee, last Splenda right here. So I'm both depressed and encouraged, but it does explain why I feel the way I do.
Right? I mean, I find this so amusing because it's like all these years we've been imagining that mind control was going to like come from the Russians or from aliens or something. And the true mind control is coming from the microscopic bacteria in our own colons, and they just want us to eat some junk food.
The literal enemy within.
Right? Yeah, but I like to, every time I'm having a junk food craving, I like to tell myself that it's just the feeling of a bad microbe trying to boss me around, and it makes it a little easier to resist. Now, one big problem, of course, is that when we are sick, it's not always realistic to eat high fiber or to eat fresh foods. And so this pomegranate, this is me, a picture of me, and this pomegranate is saying to me back when I was really sick, look, you can't stand up long enough to feed me and you can't digest well enough to eat me. Move along, I'm way out of your league. So I know what that feels like. And many people that I work with are unable to grocery shop, to stand up long enough to prepare food, to tolerate heat in order to cook anything. They have troubles digesting. And so that kind of is the main challenge. And so much of my work with clients is figuring out the best plan to, do what we can and to build back up to being able to eat more real foods again. So that is a factor. But the ultimate goal for gut health is to basically not be an American. The standard American diet is thought to be a major problem for inflammatory disease. And so these photos show 1 week of food for families in 4 different cultures. And I bet you can guess which one has skyrocketing rates of chronic inflammatory disease. In some cultures with, like quote unquote primitive diets, they don't even have autoimmune disease. They don't even know what that is. And so kind of as I mentioned before, one final thing that's wrong with the standard American way of eating is that we tend to always be eating. One study found that it's not uncommon for Americans to eat 15 times per day. And so that means that the intestines don't get their time off to do their cleaning wave, which is also important for gut health. Because remember, whenever we go about 5 hours without food, our intestines can stop digesting and do some house cleaning. And that helps keep the dysbiosis away. So this is that summary slide I was talking about. It just kind of mentions everything that we went over. If you wanted to take a screenshot of sort of the overarching, list of things you can do, this would be it. And don't feel overwhelmed, because you don't have to do all of these things to see results in my experience. Oftentimes, even just a few baby steps in the right direction can make a big difference. I've seen people who feel much better just from giving up sugar or artificial sweeteners, for example. I've seen people who all they do is they replace their factory farmed chicken with antibiotic-free chicken, and they start feeling much better. And so I think some people are lucky and they can do a couple things and see a radical difference. Other people are less lucky. And have to, do a really deep dive and do everything. But the good news is that gut health can start changing really fast, right? Because a generation of microbes only lives about 20 minutes, right? So that means that microbial empires can rise and fall very quickly. So studies have shown that dietary changes lead to gut microbiome changes in just a few days, but that goes in the good direction and the bad direction. So you have to maintain your new habits if you want to maintain the good, better microbes. And the other good news is that gut tissue is among the fastest healing tissue, right? So those of us with nerve damage wish that our nerves would heal half as fast as intestinal tissue. So this is why there's a lot of optimism. Gut health is not the only thing that affects inflammation, but it's a big one. And there are large communities of patients out there who work on their gut health and who see huge improvements in their symptoms. So if you're looking for those communities or for more information, here are some good books and websites that I recommend. This first one, the WALS protocol, in particular, has a really large community around it with a physician who used these principles to come back from severe MS, which typically isn't thought to be reversible. She was in a wheelchair, but now she can bike 20 miles. And she's leading a lot of great research in this area and has a whole detailed protocol, cookbooks, everything. Her program is pretty detailed and hardcore. If you want a gentler introduction to improving gut health, I recommend the book, The Autoimmune Fix, by Dr. Tom O'Brien. And even if you don't have an autoimmune disease, it's all the same principles for stopping inflammation, right? Inflammation and autoimmunity are kind of in the same buckets when it comes to this. Paleomom.com is a great blog. The author is a serious scientist, even though she calls herself a paleo mom. And finally, I Contain Multitudes is considered one of the best books on the microbiome, if that's of interest. So that's everything I wish I had known much earlier. I hope this information can serve you well. And I hope that if you ever take up acro yoga, it's only because you think it's super fun. So that's all I got.
Jill, thank you so much. That is an incredible amount of information and so enlightening. Just a question, I don't know if you know the answer to this. Is that the same Ed Young from the New York Times?
Yeah. He always writes those amazing science
So
things.
incidentally, Ed Young is doing a ton of work right now on COVID as well, and COVID long haulers. So I'm sure that's going to be heavily informed. Jill, so I hate to deprive you of a Sunday, but do you have time for a few questions?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so Beth, if we could give people the opportunity to unmute, but ladies and gentlemen, I just want to point out, we don't want to answer like specifically your, this is not a consult, so please keep the questions as general as possible. And Jill is available for consultations. Of course, Jill at amherstneurology.com. And and that's it for now. So Beth, are we good to go? And if Jill, you could stop screen sharing so we could see more, that would be great. And then we can see who's talking. All
I
right.
have a question for Jill.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Hi, Jill. Just a quick one. Does all inflammatory markers show up in standard ESR or CRP tests that you might get from your doctor from a blood test? Or are we going to have to delve deeper?
So I'm going to answer this as a patient, not as a medical professional, because I don't know how a medical researcher or a doctor would answer that question, but I can tell you from my own experience that it took 20 years of seeing many, many doctors for me to figure out that my problem was autoimmune, because all of my tests were coming out as inconclusive for 20 years. And so I know that at least as an N of 1, it is possible to have inflammation and autoimmunity as your problem, even when all of the typical tests for those things are coming back normal.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And ESR, eosinophil sed rate and CRP are really general markers of inflammation that, you know, can come from your gut. They can come from your abdomen. You know, they can come from your lungs. They can come from any other way. So a lot of times people will have high numbers there, but then you have to go deeper system by system. And with COVID, it's so challenging because there's inflammation in so many different areas.
Thank you so much for your information. I'm just curious about artificial sweeteners. Are sweeteners like Truvia or xylitol okay, or are they also not so good?
So that's a great question. What we know so far is that Splenda is definitely bad. NutraSweet is definitely bad. Saccharin is definitely bad. There's no evidence that I know of yet that the newer ones, such as the erythritol or the stevia, are bad for gut health. And so I guess the only thing I'd say is that as much as I love sweets myself, I feel like the law of nutrition is always unintended consequences, and anytime something seems too good to be true, it historically has been. So my guess is that small amounts of those things are fine. And my guess is that in another 20 years, they'll discover some problem with some of these artificial things, even if they were, you know, processed from natural ingredients, because just that is the trend that always seems to happen.
I just use it in my coffee.
So my guess is that a little bit is likely not. I'm a big believer that everyone only has so much willpower to spend on their diet. And so, yes, if that makes you happy, I wouldn't worry about spending willpower to avoid it.
Vaughn, don't worry. You're going to be giving up coffee tomorrow also. Smita?
No way.
Thank you, Noah and Jill. This was absolutely incredible. My question is, so is it like COVID that is impacting, like COVID itself that's having this impact, or is it like all the entire kitchen sink, including, you know, antibiotics and HCQ and all the medicines and vitamins that we take during COVID that are like resulting in this? Because it's almost like, I feel like now when I watch your presentation, I'm like, oh, like is all the stuff that I took the reason I'm having this experience of like the brain fog and all these other things?
That's such an interesting question.
My feeling, my answer to that question would be the same as 90% of other questions about COVID, which is I don't think we know. And there's a whole bunch of like swallowed the spider to catch the fly in this, which came first, the chicken or the egg. And it, I don't know, my gut feeling, no pun intended, like, and I've now seen close to 200 patients individually, is that COVID is like a virus scan. COVID is good at getting into your body, finding your weakness and exploiting it in every way possible. And I also think that every person is different. I don't know. What do you think, Jill?
Yeah, definitely. And I, you know, viruses and infections are on the list of things that can hurt gut health, but so are antibiotics. And so I think these are really interesting questions. I hope we get the answer to them someday.
Thank you.
I think if nothing else, you know, like rather than an actual roadmap here, I think this is great information to kind of, and you know, with COVID also, like I think there's zero roadmap. We're trying to kind of dig away brush, but it's like when you hear a noise, like, okay, these are some of the things we should be thinking about. You know, like if we're in Brooklyn, like the first thing you think of is not probably giraffe, but you know, I think these are things that we at least have to keep on the radar and consider. So, Shelley, did you have a question?
Mary Flynn, I have a question.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Shelley, go ahead.
Okay.
And then we'll go to
Actually,
Mary.
Yeah, that was fantastic, Jill, really. I'm curious, do you have any recipes or shopping guides that you can share with us?
So let's see. So I would say, as far as you can go online and find a whole bunch of different resources for this. The word that you would look for if you were looking for sort of the guide would be paleo autoimmune protocol. And you will find tons of resources there. What I usually do is just go to the grocery store and look and see what looks fresh and try to eat something that I haven't eaten in a while to get that variety. I kind of play a game with myself to see how many different plant foods I can get into a meal. So pre-microbe aware me might be happy with oatmeal and blueberries. Post-microbe aware me is now going to also add in cinnamon and nutmeg and shredded coconut and ground flaxseed and almonds and walnuts and every plant that I can find, because I know that each one of those different types of plant fiber is supporting a different species of microbe that is going to do something probably pretty valuable for me. So I just kind of turned it into a game to see how many plants.
Okay, I think I'd better get out of here.
But I kind of an easy short. The go-to kind of, I would say, super meals when it comes to this are going to be like stir fry, right? Get a bunch of different veggies in there, pick your protein and put it over maybe some grain of some sort. Vegetable soups, salads, veggie grain bowls, and I tend to not really look for recipes so much as just see what is looking fresh at the grocery store.
That's great. And don't worry, Jill may not know this yet, but she's not going anywhere. We're about to go into hardcore recruiting mode. Diane Cusick, do you want to ask a question and then we'll go to the PEFLEs?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Real quick, is there a measure for what would be brief inflammation as opposed to turning into chronic?
Oh, that's a good question.
Time-wise, you mean?
I'm sorry, what was that?
You mean by time or some kind of
like what would be considered, like, I don't know if I keep playing around, and I definitely, the food drives my symptoms. Like, how do I guess it's hard to know if something is temporary as opposed to forever with inflammation.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. My feeling is with COVID, I'm not ready to call anything permanent. I hear a lot of people who say, oh, you're going to have permanent lung damage. You know, there was big talk at the beginning about pulmonary fibrosis and COVID, and this idea was, is there going to be a whole new crop of lung transplant recipients? You know, I know it feels like a long time, and it has been a long time. Okay. It's, you know, 9 months. It's like, you know, it's a long time to not feel well. But there's still improvements happening with COVID. And a study just came out that showed that a lot of what was thought to be pulmonary fibrosis before, looking at ground glass opacity, is actually just inflammation that's resolving over time. So I would be really hesitant. And that's why when I hear people say, oh, this is going to be permanent damage, it's premature in my opinion. I mean, I see a lot of people, like the average person who, believe it or not, probably 80% of the people that I see now were infected in March. And that's where people are starting to get, you know, people are starting to get better. We're seeing nice improvements in people. So, Peflees.
So my question for Jill is about the intestinal cleaning wave that you talked about, and that fasting contributes to it, like 4 to 5 hours without food. My question is, does that not happen every night for us when we're sleeping, or is there something about being asleep that doesn't allow that to happen?
My understanding is that it happens during sleep, but that ideally you'd have it happen more times per day, like between every major meal. And so, so I work with a lot of people who have to graze all day. They can't eat very much. And so some people get along fine with just the cleaning wave that happens at night. Other people, their Sibo will come back if they don't take off hours between eating. So I think it's one of those things where you can see what your body needs.
Jill, is it reasonable to kind of think of it in terms of priority? Like if gut motility is your biggest problem, well, then fasting would be more beneficial to you. But like if weight loss is your biggest problem, like if you lose too much weight, because for example, one of the issues that we see with a lot of respiratory patients is that because they're working so hard to breathe, it's very hard for them to take in adequate calories, because it then affects mechanics of breathing. And also, you know, because they're working hard to breathe, they're burning a lot of calories. So
right.
How do you balance that?
Right. And that's a really good point, because when you're telling people to eat more fiber, that is kind of easy for the people who want to lose weight. All of a sudden, you're eating a lot of foods that are very calorie non-dense. The harder thing is to eat an anti-inflammatory diet that is also very high in calories. And so that's where you really want to lean into the healthy fats, because the fats are calorically dense, but they're still anti-inflammatory. So instead of going for like the Haagen-Dazs and the pizza, which is nice and high calorie, you would be doing more things like olive oil and coconut milk and salmon and the grass-fed butter, or the bone broth, or avocado, all of these things that sort of fit in the healthy fat category.
I'm sorry, I don't say this to point out an error. I'm just a question I want to clarify. Did you mean coconut oil or coconut milk?
They can both be good.
Coconut milk also. Okay, great. Let's go to Liz H, and then Mona, and then Marie. And Jill, just give me a signal like cuckoo, cuckoo, when you're ready to call it a day for Sunday. So we so appreciate you being here. Liz H.
Okay.
Hi, thanks. This has been great. I'd appreciate some clarification. A lot of people have been talking about mast cell activation syndrome, and there are two of us who are long haulers here. But what I'm finding is that looking at that as a diet is really, really massively restrictive. And I can't see how to broaden the spectrum of what you eat, and at the same time achieve a low histamine diet. So anything you can suggest, I'd appreciate.
Yeah. So when it comes to mast cell activation syndrome, so that's the syndrome where your mast cells, which are immune cells that are responsible for allergic type reactions, they tend to be too easily set off or set off to inappropriate things, and they can kind of have a domino effect. So you can be kind of constantly in a flare, set off by all kinds of things that should be no problem. And so the diet for that is called the low histamine diet. And the thinking is that if you take in fewer dietary histamines, like we know that histamine can help set off and perpetuate that chain reaction of mast cells being activated. And so the low histamine diet is super inconvenient because everything needs to be fresh, because the main thing that creates histamines is aging food that has been dead longer. But the other thing is that all of the lists online that talk about what foods are high histamine or low histamine, there's a lot of disagreement between those lists. And so a lot of people end up just avoiding everything that shows up on any list as high histamine. And I've been there, I've done that. And that is a quick way to drive yourself nuts and have nothing to eat. And so the expert consensus at this point is to do it as an elimination diet, where you start out by eliminating the most high histamine foods. And that tends to be the aged meat, the aged cheese, any fermented foods, including sauerkraut. That's the bummer, right? Sauerkraut is so good for your gut health, but it's also high in histamines. And when you cut out all of those high histamine foods, if you have mast cell activation syndrome, then there's a good chance you're going to feel a lot better. Now, if you don't feel better, then you can just forget about it. It's not going to help you. And you're just needlessly restricting your diet. But at least most of the patients that I talk to with mast cell activation syndrome, they do feel better on a low histamine diet. So then the trick becomes to start adding in foods one at a time to see if they will cause you a problem or not. And it's a very laborious elimination diet because a mast cell reaction can happen immediately, or it can happen up to 72 hours later. So you have to be very scientific. You have to keep a good food journal with all of your symptoms, because if you do have a reaction, you want to be able to, figure out, was it something that you ate 10 minutes ago or something that you ate 48 hours ago? So that's why you only reintroduce one new food every 3 or 4 days. If it doesn't cause you a problem, then that's back on your list. Even if the lists claim it's high histamine, if it works for you, I would include it back in your diet, because part of what we're talking about today is dietary diversity. Dietary diversity buys you microbial diversity, which buys you immune tolerance. And the whole goal of this is to have a more tolerant immune system. So I know it's not easy with mast cell activation syndrome, but I don't know of a better way to do it than to do the elimination diet, add things back in, and see how many foods you can get back into your life, keeping in mind that non-dietary histamine triggers are also going to be contributing. So, for example, we know that stress is a huge mast cell trigger. And there's interesting articles that can show you the exact mechanisms of how stress makes your mast cells activate. But it's kind of a bummer, because it means that just the time when you're having the most stressful time in life, it also means you're going to have the most reactions to your food. But to the extent that you can identify the non-edible mast cell triggers and avoid those, that can buy you more space in your diet to eat more high histamine foods.
Jill, can you just clarify for us, please? So is it that we're ingesting the histamine in the food itself? Is it that certain foods will cause certain individuals greater histamine responses, or is it a combination of both?
So there's kind of a trio, and I always feel bad talking about this because it's such a raw deal for mast cell patients. It's really, it's really almost unbelievable that first of all, you can just eat histamines. So anytime you eat a food that is aged, overripe, mature, fermented, and then there's a few others besides that, like the tomatoes, spinach, you're just eating histamines, and eating the histamines can trigger more mast cells. So that's number one. Now there's some talk as to foods that are histamine liberators, and it doesn't really have good research behind it, but so it's unclear whether this exists or not. But for example, citrus fruits are the ones that lots of patients claim that even though there's not a lot of histamines in citrus fruit, that citrus fruit will release histamines and set off the domino effect. And then the third thing, which is the most unfair, is that eating itself can be a mast cell trigger and release histamines. And so there are some people where no matter what they eat, it's doing it.
So I'm guessing when I go out to my car after a couple of days and finish the coffee I left there with half and half artificial sweetener in the garage, right? That's probably not so good. Okay, that's bad. Mona?
Hi, Jill. Do you hear me?
Yes, Mona.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple little Sibo questions. Is that okay?
Sure.
Oh, okay. I started having gut problems like in August 2019, and there were, make a long story short, in January, when I started losing, in January 2020, when I started losing weight, we did a test and it came back, we did the breath test and I had Sibo. Okay, I took Xifaxan for 2 weeks and it helped somewhat. And then, make a long story short, and then it started getting worse again and my symptoms started getting worse. And the two gastroenterologists who I've been seeing, you've told me more than they've ever told me, so thank you for that. But anyway, so they said that, you couldn't take it again for like 3 months. So after the 3 months, I took it again, and that was in May, and it's still not gone. So I just took another test at home yesterday, so we're waiting to see if I still have it. But my other question is, since I was diagnosed with the Sibo, foods taste totally, totally weird. That wasn't one of the symptoms you had on your thing. Is that from the Sibo or is that from something else?
That's interesting. I have not heard that before from the Sibo, but it does remind me of that article that I mentioned, that gut bacteria can control eating behaviors, and one of the ways they do it is by changing taste buds. So that wouldn't surprise me so much. But about recurring Sibo, yeah, some people do have a lot of recurring Sibo, and oftentimes if you find a physician who really is very familiar with Sibo, what they will do is they will combine the Xifaxan with some other drugs or herbs that are shown to help, and or they will also combine it with a pro-motility drug, such as low-dose naltrexone, and there's others, and ones that help keep the gut moving, because we do know that if your gut is not having the nice movement and peristalsis, then it is quite, it is a risk factor for the Sibo to just keep coming back. One other thing that can be done in combination with the treatment is the Low Fodmap Diet. And that is a diet that is designed to not give those bacteria anything that they live on. And so it's fermentable carbohydrates. And so, so if they're not getting anything to live on, then the thinking is that it makes it easier for the Xifaxan to kill them, or maybe they just starve to death. Some people stay on that diet long term, but it's not really recommended to be a super long-term diet because you are robbing yourself of healthy foods. And so ideally that would just be a temporary tool to help get rid of the SIBO. But
Marie, sorry, Joe.
Oh, I would just say if you feel like you're not having success with the doctors that you're working with now, there are some doctors who really, really specialize in SIBO and are so good with SIBO. And I think that it's worth it to find one of those doctors.
You know, there was a cafe next to our old office called Sibo, and it also gives me second thoughts about eating there anymore. Marie?
Okay, hi, thank you so much, Noah and Jill, for doing this. I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
I get the big picture and the small picture, and I really appreciate the way you've cited so many medical articles that are specific to what we're going through. I think like the madness of this is sometimes not having the expertise to do it yourself. So that'll be great. Thank you. The question I have is, I get that the best thing is a diverse diet, chewed well, you know, all of that. But you also mentioned vitamin B and D. And I wondered if you could talk about that supplementation, or also how you feel about probiotics.
And prebiotics while you're at it, please.
Sure. Yeah. So just like our bodies are sensitive to nutrient deficiencies, it turns out that gut microbes can be also. And so they need some B vitamins, they need D. And so if we can get those through diet, that's wonderful. If you cannot get them through diet, then supplementing, I think is the next best thing. In particular, vitamin D is found to be huge for inflammation, I think partially through the gut microbiome and partially just through other avenues. My understanding is that vitamin D controls can flip the switch on over 100 different genes, and that's just super incredibly important. The omega-3s are also found to be really important for that intestinal permeability and for gut health. The way to get those naturally would be through things like the cold water fatty fish, or supplementing can also be a way to get it. When it comes to probiotics, this is where I think, I wish that research could just be sped up 20 years, because I expect that in 20 years, they'll be able to they'll take a fingerprint of your gut microbiome, figure out what you have too much of or too little of. They'll be able to, replace it and give you a perfect gut microbiome, and, life will be great. Right now, I think there's some studies showing that for some inflammatory conditions, certain probiotics can help. And every time I work with a client, I recheck the data on that for whatever their condition is, because the stuff is coming out so fast. Like every week, there's new exciting stuff about that. As far as probiotics in general, in the absence, if there is no study that can guide us, my suggestion is to start with things like sauerkraut and kimchi first, because you get way more diversity than you get in any of the supplements. B, we know that when you eat your probiotics on fermented vegetables, they survive the trip to your colon because they have that fiber to cling to, and it kind of serves as a little life raft. A lot of the probiotic supplements that we take they just die in our stomach acid, and they never even get to our colon anyways. And so I guess I think that probiotics are super promising. I think they're probably going to find that it's one of those things where it's not one size fits all. Different people see different results with different probiotics. And I just don't know if there's enough guidance right now for most people on which one to try or which one to take. There's a couple that have a lot more research than others for safety, and that would be like VSL number 3 and Dysbiosis. And they have some good research for helping with certain things. So if I was going to just kind of take a stab in the dark and start with a couple, those would be the ones that I'd start with.
Awesome. My gastroenterologist also said VSL3 is one of like it's almost like a medical food. And it's been super tested with great results. Last question from Suzanne B, and then I'm just going to ask one question from the chat, and then we're going to let you go. I feel like you should have a residency here, sort of like Celine Dion in Vegas, but
You're very kind.
but all right, Suzanne, go for it.
I think this may have been answered, so I'll start with a great big thank you for doing this. This has been extremely helpful and valuable. But you started off telling us that that it can be autoimmune caused by the virus potentially, and somebody had asked about temporary versus permanent, and I know we can't obviously answer that fully at this point, but is there a chance that it won't just go into remission, but that if it is an autoimmune, that it would actually resolve itself permanently?
Yeah, so that's the big optimistic thing about the reigning theory of this, right? So, Alessio Fasano is this great researcher at Boston Children's Hospital, somewhere in Boston. And he is this great researcher on the gut barrier. And he's the one who has figured out that those little gates in the gut barrier, that open up and close, that he believes that in order for autoimmunity to perpetuate, you need to have that dysfunction in that gut barrier, that your little gates are too open too often so that garbage is getting into the bloodstream through the gut and keeping your immune system overly riled up. And his theory, and he's accumulating research that keeps supporting this, so that's very exciting, is that if you can fix the dysbiosis so that those gut microbes do their job and heal the gut lining so that you no longer have leaky gut and you no longer have garbage pouring into your bloodstream from your intestines, his theory and his evidence so far is suggesting that if you do that, then the immune system stops being so on guard, and that the autoimmune damage can stop. So I can tell you that with the clients that I see, the people who have the huge improvements, who completely turn around their health, are the ones who pay attention to gut health. It's not the people who decide that they're gonna lose weight. It's not the people who decide they're gonna go keto. It's not the people who decide they're gonna perfect their ratio of carbs to protein to fat. It's the people who really pay attention to gut health through food. And also remember, it's not just food, it's like chemicals from your shampoo and your soap and your cleaning products too. But those are the people that I see having their autoimmune disorders go away. And if you look in some of those communities that I mentioned, you'll see tons of examples of people who find the same thing. So I guess that's like, I don't feel medically qualified to tell you that, yes, I guarantee that your autoimmune system or that your autoimmune disease can be halted, but I can tell you that a ton of people out there feel that this is working for them and that they're seeing the results.
That makes so much sense. I mean, it's really like the fertility of the soil in which you grow your plants or your trees. I have just one more question, speaking of fertility. So I want to just ask, so many of the long haulers that we see are young women, and we find that a lot of them report a worsening of their symptoms or an exacerbation or kind of experiencing a setback during their periods. So is there anything nutritionally that can help support in that area?
So that's a great question. And boy, I don't know if it's a coincidence that that is exactly what you see in dysautonomia and POTS too. So I can tell you that we know that ginger is one thing that can help prevent PMS pain and PMS symptoms. Can it change, like, you know, I don't know what's going on with all of this stuff and menses and hormones. But if it is related to a thing, you know, I guess ginger would be my best guess, is to see if the things that help with PMS might also help with this.
And in what form would you get that ginger?
Tea is the easy way, but if you're a good cook and you want to make some ginger stir fry or put some ginger into your curry, I'm lazy. I just do tea.
Gotcha. All right, guys, I know we could sit here for another 8 to 12 hours listening to this. Jill, I feel like we should say we're not worthy. Really phenomenal, fascinating and complete and kind and so beneficial. And we have to talk because this cannot be the end. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great weekend. And Beth, we could unmute everybody so that we can't unmute everybody. Okay, so we're gonna have to do some performance art without sounds or unmute yourself. And we want to show Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
We could do this like a wave. Everybody get as much action as one at once.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you, Noah.
And we will see you all very soon. Feel good, everybody.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was
Bye.
wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you.
Awesome, Jill. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You guys have a beautiful thing going here. This is so great to see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But we're just friends. Just kidding. It wouldn't be a webinar of mine if I didn't say something inappropriate. So I'm glad I got to squeeze that in. Have a great day, everybody.